It's about the white spaces between the paragraphs, which I think are more important than any of the text.
For decades, Fred Rogers has been the gentle do-gooder of American childhood. Cardigan, soft-spoken wisdom, and a neighborhood where every problem had a caring, humane answer. The public portrait is comforting, simple, and nearly sacred. But what if that portrait is incomplete? What if the story you were told in kindergarten, and then retold to your children, left out the struggles, the conflicts, and the calculated choices that shaped the man behind the cardigan? Newly surfaced documents, private letters, and interviews with people who knew him well paint a far more complex picture. Far from being merely a placid children's host, Mr. Rogers was a strategic cultural figure who navigated, sometimes forcefully, the shifting moral and political landscapes of mid-century America. He fought battles behind the scenes, made uncomfortable compromises, and guarded secrets about the business of running a beloved brand that most viewers never suspected. This isn't an attempt to tear down a hero. Rather, it's an attempt to understand him fully. The contradictions between his public calm and private intensity. The creative decisions that softened difficult truths for young viewers. And the alliances he formed to protect his program. There are stories of tense meetings with network executives, the moments when his ideals collided with commercial interests, and personal sacrifices made to keep his message on the air. And then there are the things nobody expected. Revelations about how he handled criticism, the influences that shaped his moral lessons, and the personal losses that deepened his empathy. Each new fact reframes familiar episodes and classic lines, turning them from quaint television moments into carefully chosen lessons with history behind them. If you thought you knew Mr. Rogers, think again. The truth is messier, richer, and ultimately more human. And it changes everything you thought you understood about the man who taught a nation how to be kind. For most of us, Fred Rogers is a symbol of pure goodness, a man whose cardigan sweaters, soft voice, and gentle presence shaped entire generations. But long before he became America's moral compass, Mr. Rogers was a young man fighting a very different world, a world where children's television was loud, chaotic, and deeply commercial. The public knows the legend. What they don't know is how much he battled to create the calm, compassionate universe we now associate with his name. Fred Rogers did not enter television because he loved the medium. In fact, he initially hated it. When he first saw children's programming in the early 1950s, he was shocked. Kids' shows were filled with slapstick violence, empty jokes, and advertising aimed at young minds. Rogers later described it as insulting. That anger, not nostalgia, is what pushed him toward the screen. He believed children deserved better, and he intended to build something honest in a world that rewarded the opposite. But creating that kind of show meant walking directly into conflict. TV networks cared about ratings, not values. Producers wanted fast laughs, not thoughtful messages. And investors wanted profit, not philosophy. From the start, Rogers was the odd one out. The quiet man who refused to treat children like miniature consumers. Behind closed doors, executives labeled him as too soft, too slow, even too idealistic to succeed. The truth is, Mr. Rogers became Mr. Rogers because he refused to compromise. He fought to keep commercial influence out of his program. He demanded creative control so he could address real emotional issues instead of watered-down stories. And he insisted on speaking to children as equals, something nearly unheard of at the time. These decisions made him a target in meetings, but he didn't bend. He wasn't just a host. He was a strategist who understood exactly what he wanted to build. There's another side of the story many never hear. The emotional cost of carrying a message so deeply personal. Rogers wasn't simply performing kindness. He was living through his own struggles, insecurities, and doubts while trying to guide millions of children through theirs. Friends recall nights when he questioned whether he was truly making a difference, wondering if the pressures of television were pulling him away from the very ideals he fought to protect. Yet each time he doubted himself, something pulled him back. Letters from children, stories from parents, or moments in which he saw firsthand the impact of genuine compassion. Those reminders kept him grounded, strengthening his resolve to make his show more than entertainment. It was a mission, and missions demand sacrifice. As the show grew, so did the myths. People called him a saint, a miracle worker, an angel disguised as a neighbor. But those labels created a different kind of burden, one that followed him for decades. The public expected perfection. Every gesture, every word, every lesson had to reflect the idealized version of Fred Rogers they carried in their minds. Few knew the pressure that came with that image, or how much effort he poured into protecting the trust children placed in him. The truth is, Mr. Rogers was far more human than the legend suggests. He had fears. He had frustrations. He had moments when he felt overwhelmed, even heartbroken, by the complexity of the world he tried so hard to simplify for young minds. But rather than breaking him, these challenges shaped him. They pushed him to be more intentional, more thoughtful, and more determined to create a space where children felt seen and valued. This is the side of Mr. Rogers most people never hear about, the relentless advocate, the quiet fighter, the man who walked into a chaotic television industry and dared to say, "Children deserve better." His greatness wasn't effortless. It was earned through struggle, conviction, and countless battles behind the scenes. And understanding the real Fred Rogers requires turning away from the myth and seeing the human being, the one whose journey was far more complex than any cardigan lesson ever revealed. For decades, people whispered strange stories about Mr. Rogers, stories that painted him as someone completely different from the gentle, soft-spoken man on television. Some claimed he had a secret past in the military. Others insisted he was hiding scars beneath those colorful cardigans. And some people even believed he crafted his quiet persona to cover a darker truth. But here's what almost nobody knows. Behind the cameras, Fred Rogers carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He read every letter sent to him, every single one, and many came from children dealing with fear, grief, and trauma. And instead of passing them off to a team, he responded personally, often staying up late into the night just to make sure no child felt unheard. People thought he was too perfect, but the truth is far more powerful and far more human. Mr. Rogers wasn't hiding a scandal. He was hiding something else entirely. A lifelong battle with doubt, exhaustion, and the unimaginable emotional burden of being America's comfort figure. And in the next chapter, you'll discover the moment everything almost fell apart for him, and why the world never knew. There was one moment in Fred Rogers' life that almost changed everything. One moment so heavy, so overwhelming, that he quietly considered ending Mr. Rogers' neighborhood for good. It happened in the late 1970s, during a time when children's television was shifting, and networks were demanding louder, flashier, faster shows. Executives didn't believe Fred's gentle approach could survive in a world becoming more chaotic by the day. They pushed him to modernize, to add more excitement, more noise, more gimmicks. Fred refused. But it wasn't the criticism that broke him. It was the growing pressure he felt from the families who watched him. Every day, letters from children dealing with divorce, death, illness, and fear poured in. And Fred answered them, faithfully, tirelessly, compassionately. He felt responsible for their hearts. One night, after reading a heartbreaking letter from a young boy who had just lost his father, Fred closed the studio door, sat alone in the empty set, and whispered to himself, "Am I doing enough? Can I keep doing this?" He felt drained, emotionally, spiritually, physically. The weight of being a symbol of kindness had become almost too much for one man to carry. For the first time in his life, Fred Rogers thought about walking away. But something unexpected happened the very next morning. Something that convinced him to keep going, even stronger than before. And in the next chapter, you'll learn exactly what that moment was, because it would change not just his life, but the lives of millions of children forever. The morning after Fred Rogers quietly wondered if he should walk away forever, he walked into the studio expecting another exhausting day. But instead, fate had prepared something else. Something he never forgot for the rest of his life. A small group of visitors had been scheduled to tour the studio. Among them was a teenage boy, around 14, in a wheelchair. The boy had been battling a severe illness for years, and his doctors weren't sure how much time he had left. But there was one thing he asked to do, one thing he insisted on doing while he still had the strength. "I want to meet Mr. Rogers." When Fred heard this, he immediately stopped everything and walked over to the boy. But what happened next stunned even Fred. The boy was so nervous he couldn't speak. His hands were shaking. His mother leaned over and whispered, "He's watched you every day since he was 5. You're the reason he never gave up." Fred didn't respond with a grand speech. He simply kneeled down, took the boy's hand and said softly, "Thank you for being my friend." The boy smiled, weakly but sincerely. And then he managed to say, "You helped me feel normal. I didn't feel scared when you were talking." Fred Rogers felt something shift inside him, all the network's pressure, all the doubts, all the exhaustion. It faded in that moment, because he suddenly remembered why he began this journey in the first place. To make even one child feel loved, understood, and safe. When the boy left, the studio crew noticed something different in Fred. His shoulders were straighter. His voice was lighter. The quiet sadness in his eyes was gone. That afternoon, he walked into the production meeting and said, "We are not changing the show. Not one bit. There is nothing wrong with kindness." And from that point forward, he became even more determined, more protective of his message, more committed to his gentle philosophy. It was the day Mr. Rogers nearly gave up. In the day a child unknowingly brought him back.